Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's lesson is on the consolidation of Nazi power um, in 1933 and 34, the consolidation of an absolute authoritarian regime with Adolf Hitler as the supreme authority, which occurs in 1933 to 1934 and was kind of the last phase in a series of movements prior to position Adolf Hitler as the supreme head of Germany. This phase is also really embodied by a term Gleichschaltung, which refers to the consolidation of power, but literally translates to bringing into line, putting into the same gear, and it refers to a coordination of Germany on all levels to fall in line with the Nazi leadership. Hitler takes a number of different moves to destroy any last semblance of constitutional government. It's during 1933 that you really see the emergence of the Third Reich and the end of the Weimar Republic. Initially, the Nazis came after Hitler was appointed. The Nazis control the state, but it still remained a coalition regime. And many individuals, conservative individuals for example, believed that there were enough conservative votes and enough sort of constitutional promises and checks to prevent Hitler from getting out of control. Throughout Hitler's consolidation, the Nazis perform many illegal actions, but many of the things they do are done under the context or the image that they are in fact legal. But the ultimate goal for Hitler in the beginning of his creation of an authoritarian regime and his grand goal to rearm Germany is first to eliminate any last vestiges of democracy, eliminate any last vestiges of the constitutional state, and to eliminate political opposition not only in the Reichstag, in the German parliament, but on all levels of German society, at least as much as was possible. In February, Hitler's first move at ending the constitutional Weimar state and consolidating his authoritarian regime came first through the targeting of the Communist Party, as well as also the Socialist Party, but most specifically at this time, the Communist Party. In a lot of respects, Hitler used certain, if you will, loopholes within the presidential system to eliminate constitutional checks to his authority. And this really starts in earnest in February. On February 27th, the Reichstag, there's a fire at the Reichstag, and the communists will be blamed for this. The next day, Hitler, on February 28th, issues an emergency decree in which he's expanding his political authority, he's limiting civil freedoms, and limiting freedoms of press and assembly, and in this process the Nazis are slowly taking control over information and politicalization in the country. The SA after this, which were the SA are the brown shirts, they are or were the paramilitary army of the Nazis, and at this time they were over 400,000 strong. And if you include reservists, they were an army that was rising towards 1 million individuals. The communists are charged with this fire, and this fire is used as incentive to attack and eliminate one of the political opponents from of the Nazi regime, and that were the communists. The Reichstag fire is exploited by the Nazis. A mentally ill Dutch communist is convicted by the Nazis, and the Nazis use this fire as a way to suspend civil liberties, to undermine the Communist Party, which had become a very powerful radical faction in Germany, to eliminate the Communist Party in Germany out of the promotion of a fear of a communist, like Bolshevik-style revolution. The result was arbitrary arrests and imprisonments throughout Germany, and these types of activities increasingly will create a lot of fear amongst many individuals in German society. The emergency decree, which suspended basically all civil liberties in favor of the authority of Hitler's leadership, was never actually revoked. For a long time, historians had contended that the Nazis had purposely done this arson as a way of creating a convenient national emergency. However, there's really no evidence to suggest that that's true, and so the cause of the fire does remain unknown, whether in fact it was actually a communist attack on the Reichstag, or if it was a planted effort by the Nazis to use this as a way of exploiting a crisis situation. On March 5th, 1933, there's another round of elections. And in these elections, the Nazis scored 44% of the vote, which was the highest that they had ever scored. Certainly that is a product of a political marginalization of other parties, of domestic terrorism. That number is also a product of the fact that Hitler's vague and emotional rhetoric built up a number of or at least built up a degree of support from some individuals. Some communists had even left the Communist Party out of a belief that Hitler's rhetoric of sort of social reforms would be a reality, that Hitler would create sweeping social and economic changes that would benefit, workers and so forth. This had a lot to do with this number had a lot to do with, of course, SA terrorism. It also had a lot to do with propaganda and the sort of emotional appeals that Hitler made, as well as Hitler's new position as chancellor, which gave him a momentum. After the elections in which the Nazi Party gained 44% of the vote, Hitler opens a new Reichstag, a new Nazi Reichstag. And the Nazis make up 44% of that body, but they still very much needed to build alliances, particularly with the conservative aspect of the body. And they will need the conservatives to vote with them in order to pass the enabling acts, which will be passed on March 24th, and which were the acts that basically gave Hitler absolute authority. 3 days before that, on the 21st of March, Hitler spoke at Potsdam and opened a new Reichstag, and Hindenburg was president, and Hitler met Hindenburg. This was, for the Nazis, a large propaganda triumph. It was broadcast on national radio. The Nazis used the radio as a mouthpiece for propaganda, and this was an opportunity for Hitler to present the Nazi Party in a sort of symbolic union with the old Prussian generation of Germany. And so here in old Hindenburg, in his early 80s, meets Adolf Hitler, where Adolf Hitler would speak. And Hitler was dressed humbly in attire and showed a sort of humble deference to Hindenburg. Even though Hindenburg had really never been a sort of avid supporter of Hitler. Hindenburg was reluctant to appoint him initially to the chancellorship, and though he is in his older age sort of wooed to some degree by Hitler and the Nazis, generally Hindenburg was very lukewarm in any support of Hitler. But this opening of this new Reichstag um, that occurs in March of 1933 was highly significant, particularly in how the Nazis used it as a propaganda play. The last final blow, if you will, to the Weimar constitutional system was actually through a vote from the Reichstag to basically destroy itself. Amid the fears in German society of a communist revolution, within the fears that the country could fall apart, Hitler drove the Reichstag largely through much intimidation and power, and of course the decapitation of the Communist Party, which had made up a very legitimate wing of the Reichstag at this time. Hitler pushes the Reichstag to vote unprecedented and absolute powers to Hitler. This was, of course, going beyond the emergency clause of Article 48 that had been used in the Weimar Republic during times of political fragmentation and economic and social crisis. And this went farther beyond this, though, by basically completely eliminating constitutional power and increasingly consolidating absolute authority with Hitler. This was done constitutionally, and it was done largely because the Nazis are able to convince the remaining minority of the Center Party to vote with them. And this came largely out of Center Party fears of leftism, but also out of intimidation and political manipulation. And so the Center Party caves. The only party to resist this were the Social Democrats, and they did so under extreme intimidation, and they do resist this, and many of them will be persecuted, arrested, and many of them will die in concentration camps. The final acts in the consolidation of Nazi power involved, after Hitler had effectively, through the Enabling Act, achieved a kind of absolute authority as the head of the federal government. The last phase involved effectively purging any resistance on the smaller level, on the local levels. And the Nazis appointed governors to states to Nazify German society. They purged education and civil service industries. They purged these industries of suspected communists, of opposed intellectuals, of Jewish individuals, of course. Thousands of people lost their careers and their jobs. Many of them were the most significant and excellent German intellectuals, and they were purged in 1933 from civil service and education in Germany. Labor unions are purged, and the Nazis do this largely by placating the labor unions, by Hitler returning again to the false rhetoric that he would represent sort of the interest of socialist workers. The idea that Hitler would represent ideals that workers had uplifted, like, for example, the nationalization of important industries and so forth. Hitler had no intention of doing this, but he used these types of ideas to play to the emotion of workers. And remember, the Nazis were extremely efficient at the usage of communication and at the usage of propaganda as a way to placate potential opponents. And labor unions are paralyzed, and in some respects, the local labor unions represented the last true avenue capable of resisting Hitler's move to consolidate a total authority in the society. But the labor unions are paralyzed by Hitler's propaganda and emotional rhetoric. Hitler uses May Day as kind of a theatrical event to placate the position of labor, and then groups like the SA will move in and effectively fracture and eliminate the leadership of labor unions in Germany. Political parties, radical political parties like the Communists, of course, were purged and prohibited. The Socialist Party was prohibited, and these parties under pressure and terrorism from the Nazis are effectively dissolved. By July 14, 1933, Germany is a true one-party state, and Hitler declares the national revolution is over. At this point, we have the end officially of the Weimar Republic and the emergence of the Third Reich. Gleichschaltung can be thought of as a movement to eliminate institutional and psychological bases for resistance, to bring control to at all levels, social control at all levels of society. So the goal behind the Nazification of society, as I mentioned in the previous slide, came through the process of eliminating a social space for that was free of Nazi influence and control, to enable social control of the Nazis through indoctrination, supervision, to use terror to destroy trust and social ties, to isolate individuals so that there could be no material or emotional support for dissenters, to atomize individuals, make them vulnerable to manipulation and control, and to make this as the key process for the long-term Nazi goals for remaking society and implementing radical ideological policies without resistance. So Gleichschaltung is the coordination of power in a lot of ways, eliminating institutional and psychological bases for resistance and creating Nazi control on all levels of society. The Nazis used the radio to take their message, their propaganda, to all places at all times. And of course, as this image depicts, the Nazis were exceptional at using information and using technology as a way to communicate propaganda. In the early 30s, Hitler used the airplane to fly throughout Germany. After he was allowed to speak, he was banned in many places in Germany when he rose to power. Once those bans were lifted, he used the airplane to move throughout Germany to politically mobilize people. The Nazis also used radios to communicate their message, and Nazi propaganda really dominates the airwaves, as the Nazis distributed cheap radios as a way in order to reach the entire populace. The Nazis used terrorism to legitimize their power, and this is a map of the network of concentration camps that were used for political prisoners between 1933 and 1934. So the use of concentration camps by the Nazis was in apparatus and infrastructure that was in place long before the Holocaust began. This was put in place as the Nazis terrorized the society largely through the brown shirt SAs, who operated in the streets as a brute force that started fights and harassed people, arrested people. As this was occurred, there were concentration camps built throughout Germany to deal with political prisoners. The concentration camps were originally established for political enemies, and these camps were widely known through word of mouth and also through Nazi propaganda that presented the camps as re-education centers. And these camps are a testament to the usage of fear and terrorism by the Nazi regime as a method of control and the method of consolidating itself as an authoritarian and absolute power in Germany. In the picture you have the SS chief, Heinrich Himmler, at one of these camps. The SS began as Hitler's personal bodyguard unit and ultimately will overtake the SA as the sort of central apparatus of the Nazi military structure. The SS becomes associated with the death camps of World War II, and Heinrich Himmler oversaw these camps and oversaw groups like the Einsatzgruppen, which was a death squad designed to move throughout Eastern Europe during World War II and execute Poles and Slavs. Responsibility for millions of, of deaths. And this was an organization that was headed up and directed by Heinrich Himmler. In 1934, Hitler goes through the last phase of his consolidation of power, and this meant eliminating enemies from within, and in this case, particularly the SA. The SA had grown by 1934 to an army of over a million, and it was, in a lot of respects, a paramilitary army that was actually larger than the legal, according to Versailles, larger than the legal army in Germany. It had been an army that was designed to take the Nazi movement to the street. They used brute force. They used arrests. They used to beat people up. They used various forms of violence to help create and terrorize German society. The SA was headed by Ernest Röhm, who is pictured here. After Hitler had really purged the communists, after he had purged the SPD, after he had purged, really the Reichstag in entirety, and by July 1933, after he's declaring this one-party system in Germany, he declares that effectively the revolution is over. But the SA really was mobilizing and representing a radical mass movement. Many of the groups in the SA had hoped to or believed that they could pursue a true sort of socialist realization in Germany. Many thought or believed that they would carry through a nationalization of industry in the country, that there would be real actions, anti-capitalist actions taken in Germany. Hitler wasn't interested in this. He very much used that kind of propaganda to build support for his party. He very much used the propaganda of kind of anti-capitalist socialism to paralyze labor and so forth. But he was not really interested in that. Hitler knew that he needed big business and corporate interests to consolidate his power, to rearm, and pursue his long-term objectives that centered around creating a large German state for the German people, to achieving the notion of Lebensraum, which meant living space for the ethnic German nation. And so Hitler had no intention of creating a kind of a real kind of economic socialism. He used the propaganda at times, but he was not interested in that. And in many respects, he would ally himself much more closely to capitalist business interests as a way of facilitating his power. And he feared that he didn't want to undermine the kind of economic status quo for fear that it would undermine his grand goal of effectively creating war and creating an expansive, militarized German nation, largely through violence conducted against portions of Eastern Europe, of course. So he had a problem with the SA because the SA had become a rival for power. The SA potentially threatened Hitler's power. They were also opposed by the German army, who saw them also as a threat to the army's position in society too. And so as a result of that, Hitler is going to purge the SA, and through this he will effectively destroy the last vestiges of political enemies, and he will create an alliance with the army and create an apparatus that is even more supportive of his absolute authority. In many respects, the SA might have been seen by Hitler also as a political liability. They were widely feared and disliked by ordinary Germans because they were violent and they arbitrarily beat people up. They were a paramilitary force. The army did not like them. People in German society didn't like them because they were these like mafioso kind of brute squads on the streets of Germany, and this created a lot of animosity amongst the German people. They also obviously potentially threatened the legitimacy of Hitler's regime and the potential popularity of the regime, though, of course, as we know, the Nazi regime never garnished more than a third of the country in true support. But Hitler's viewpoint, it was a potential threat to his power, and it was a potential threat to his power not only as personal enemy to him, but also on other levels of society. So Hitler breaks with the SA, and he will purge the SA. He believed that he needs conservative support within his new Third Reich. Hindenburg is dying, and Hitler needs to consolidate his power by using conservative and capitalist businessmen and the army to consolidate his power. The SS, which as you see depicted here, was originally Adolf Hitler's kind of bodyguard, and they will become the political elite within the state. They will replace the SA as the key instrument of the Nazi regime when it came to the domestic policing of Germany, and also the SS become associated as some of the most effective German military divisions, and also, of course, the SS Einsatzgruppen, which were the death squads that operated during World War II in places like Poland and oversaw the killing of millions of people. The army will support Hitler because of nationalist and militarist reasons. They were threatened by the SA's calls for an abolition of the army in favor of a more SA-dominated people's force. And of course, this all comes to the fore during something called the Night of the Long Knives, which was really a move by the forces loyal to Hitler to effectively destroy the SA and also to take certain personal political scores and to eliminate political opponents. The SS and the army collaborate together, and during this period you see the arrest and mass murder of about 200 people, including Ernest Röhm and other highly significant individuals, many of whom were innocent. And this was very much something that Hitler has to come and speak and defend, as is depicted in these political cartoons, as clearly during the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had used an excessive force within his own country and within his own political apparatus to seize a even more authoritarian power in Germany. And of course, how does Hitler defend it? He defends it as preventing revolution. He defends it, through the use of emergency measures to prevent a revolution that sought to overthrow the leadership in Germany. The political fallout of the Night of the Long Knives, of course, there was a lot of concern over this, and so Hitler takes responsibility, but he doesn't really truly take responsibility what's actually going on. Instead, he blames the situation on Ernest Röhm as treasonous, plotting a revolution, as him being corrupt or homosexual. He largely says that he was acting to prevent a state revolution, that Röhm was corrupt and treasonous. And in reality, of course, this is really a political consolidation. It's the last phase in Hitler consolidating his power as the absolute authority in Germany. It's also another move in enshrining murder as a fundamental component of state policy. And here you see in this picture, you see one of Hitler's SS bodyguard, with the trumpet and the image of the skull and crossbones, depicting the significance of murder and terrorism within this new state. So I hope this stuff is helpful, guys, in kind of piecing together the rather complex path that occurs in 1933 and 1934 of Hitler's consolidation as an absolute authoritarian leader in Nazi Germany.